Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
It isn't fate, and it isn't luck that this home burned down, and this home didn't. The difference is being firewise. Use non-combustible roofing. Screen your attic and eave vents. Create a 3-foot area around your house with fire-resistant vegetation or rock gardens. Remove tall grass and spruce trees within 15 feet and keep firewood 30 feet away. Take the steps to protect your home today before tragedy like this happens to you. Wildfires happen. Be ready.
The National Weather Service.
Good Tuesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 29th of April. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your latest weather forecast and satellite radar imagery, as well as current weather observations at arh.noaa.gov or weather.gov/Alaska. Give us a call at the Weather Info line at 800-472-0391. And between the Alaska Weather Shows, you can find us on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. Today we've posted some information about what's going on up around Eagle, Alaska, with the breakup commencing up and down the Yukon and the Kuskokwim and many of the smaller rivers as well. We caught some late-minute visitors crossing the Yukon, or at least it looked like they're about to. So check that out on Facebook and on Twitter there. The link should be available right now. Looking northward toward the eastern parts of the Alaska Range, dry weather conditions continue there, and with low humidity and gusty winds possible through tonight. Red flag warning is in effect there for the Deltana and Tanana Flats region, as well as parts of the eastern Alaska Range. Those conditions may continue as we head into the week, with some of the driest conditions right now located around the Deltana and Tanana Flats region in the entire state. Farther northward, winter weather advisories all the way from Ambler into the south-facing slopes of the eastern Brooks Range. That will continue until at least midnight tonight, thanks to additional snowfall in those areas. So plan on some low visibility and, again, some gusty winds at times, again, for the winter weather advisory along the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range from Ambler all the way out toward Arctic Village. Since it is breakup, the spring flood potential is still a very high interest around the state. I wanted to remind folks that north of the Brooks Range summits, above average flooding is possible there. This is the potential map, not what is actually occurring right now. And across south central and southwestern Alaska, including Kodiak, below average runoff is expected at this point, mainly due to that snow melt. You can see the village dots here located anywhere from low to the low moderate category for what is happening for flood potential in those particular locations. But for what's really going on right now, we have to turn to the breakup map. This was issued late this afternoon. You can always get the latest map at aprfc.arh.noaa.gov or weather.gov/aprfc. Either way, it'll get you to the same place. And you'll see the map here on the front page. The color coding here on the side tells you how that section of river is doing, and we're noticing the middle Tanana and some parts of the upper Tanana anywhere from mostly open to at least some open. The upper Kuskokwim is showing some signs of breakup there. A few sections are beginning to open up as well. And we saw a little bit of open water up around Eagle, and we'll have updates on the map as we go through today and tomorrow. And conditions may change quickly during the next couple days, that you'll see several iterations or versions of this map just in a single setting. So make sure you go back and check that out if you're located along a section of the river that usually has some trouble, or perhaps you're expecting a little bit more of a trickier breakup, which we don't have any information that any spot is going to have any worse time this year round. But make sure you're checking up on this. And we encourage you to share your information with the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center. You can do that by using Twitter and communicating with the river forecasters and the hydrologists that way, or simply giving us a call or using email there. And you'll find information on how to do that on our website. Today's fire danger, as we were just seeing with the red flag warning around the eastern Alaska Range and the Deltana and Tanana Flats region, is anywhere from high to almost extreme in some cases there, thanks to that red flag warning. So dry conditions will prevail. It doesn't look like any major blast of moisture or precipitation, certainly not rainfall, coming our way in the next several days. So with winds, southerly flow, warm air and low humidity, the conditions will continue to be probably at least in the high category. Looking out to the west then, and the actual weather that's been occurring, low pressure is working across the Bering Sea. You can see a broad southerly flow sweeping across the central and eastern Aleutians, running up the west coast. Moisture is working up through the Bering Strait, and there are some rain and snow showers embedded in that, becoming more likely to be rain the farther south you go. The backside of the system is producing rain and snow showers there, and gales for a large part of the Bering and the Aleutian chain. It doesn't look like this is a terrible wind maker, but it is one that's cranking up a little bit of a breeze, and gusts have been in the 30 to 40 mile an hour range across at least a large part of the Aleutians, and probably stronger in some offshore areas. As you look at the rest of Alaska, high pressure is protecting quite a bit of real estate from central and south parts of Alaska toward Kodiak Island, the Alaska Peninsula, and even in areas in southeast. You can see another wave of low pressure working its way northward. And this has pretty much been stalled out very close to the Dixon entrance and Haida Gwaii. And while high pressure across British Columbia is holding this system back across the water, it has been producing some light rain across some parts of southern southeast. Looking farther northward, low clouds and some stronger winds have produced blizzard conditions at times across the Arctic coast, and winter weather advisories and even some warnings were out earlier today. Those have been dropped for the Arctic coast at this point. And a broad area of low pressure and clouds will continue to just graze the western coast over the next several days as high pressure pretty much blocks this system from advancing, keeping a large part of the area very dry and warm, and many areas in the west a little bit more unsettled. Low pressure across the northeastern Gulf has a frontal boundary attached to it. That's tracking slowly northeast. The active part of the system is a little bit further south. Dry weather across the interior continues. We've got a cold front that's working its way northward again with snow and blowing snow at times. And then across the south and west, a more active and powerful storm at 980 millibars is working its way north and will start to back a little bit more toward the Kamchatka Peninsula. Tonight, the low pressure system will drop to about 978 millibars, and you can see the packing of these isobars here. These lines of constant pressure should indicate a stronger southerly flow, at least working its way across the YK Delta, Bristol Bay, and all the way into the central and eastern Aleutian chain. High pressure sitting across the Copper River Basin to Prince William Sound and the north and western Gulf around 1,030 millibars, and it's pretty tough stuff. It's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. With that, a few clouds may develop from time to time. More often than not, you'll see the sun breaking through, probably a partly sunny day in most areas. And then out across the west, you can see the moisture feed coming in from the Pacific, crossing into the Bering, with pockets of rainfall there all the way from Unalaska, Dutch Harbor, Nikolsky, Adak, and Atka looking at showery weather, and into the Pribilofs, St. Matthew, St. Lawrence, all the way through the Bering Strait and Tin City up through Kotzebue Sound. And then, only then, after it crosses into the Chukchi Seacoast, do we seem to have a chance for that to mix in with some snowfall. So this is actually a fairly warm system, and with that strong southerly flow, it doesn't look like that's going to change. For most of mainland Alaska, it looks to be fairly dry. For southeast, rainfall will continue to focus along the frontal boundary and may creep northward at times up into the Lynn Canal. A better chance that will be showery than anything else. Thursday, conditions seem to dry out a little bit more. Another wave of colder air will try and make a run through the Yukon. Most of that will stay well away from south central and even southeastern Alaska, staying east of the highest terrain. Across the Bering Sea, frontal boundary starts to throw on the brakes once again, and the battle of colder and warmer air will park pretty much just west of the Bering Strait and through the central Aleutians. And along that line, do expect some scattered areas of rainfall. The winds should let up somewhat, especially across some areas in the central and eastern chain, as high pressure starts to make more of a mark there across Bristol Bay and the northern interior. Out across the west, a new wave of low pressure is working into the western chain at 1,007 millibars. Scattered areas of rain and snow will start to move in ahead of that system. Behind it, slightly cooler air is expected to move into the western chain as we head toward the end of the week. Temperature-wise, it's been a fairly mild day. In fact, at this day in weather history, in 2005, Anchorage saw its highest temperature in April as far as recorded weather history goes. That number was 72. Today's high temperature was in the lower to mid 50s. Across southeast today, low to mid 50s for some of the warmest spots in the inner waterways around Juneau, 54 degrees, mid to upper 40s for southern parts of southeast, including Ketchikan, Annette, and even Hyder. Around Sitka it was 48, Yakutat was 44, Middleton Island 48 degrees, 50 in Cordova, 47 in Valdez, most of the Kenai Peninsula in the 40s and 50s, including Kenai at 46. Talkeetna was a very mild 55. Healy and Greeley both in the low to mid 50s. Fairbanks just shy of 60. Eagle had you beat at 62. Northway was 52 degrees. Fort Yukon 54. 30s and 40s across the Brooks Range, including Anaktuvuk Pass at 36. The Arctic coast in the teens and 20s. Colder at Barrow at 13, 32 around Wainwright today. Just a little bit warmer for Kivalina. Kotzebue was 34, Shishmaref 32 degrees, Nome about the same, Tin City 28 degrees, St. Lawrence around Savunga 34 degrees, the YK Delta in the 30s and 40s, and McGrath a little bit cooler than 50 degrees today. Tanana showing temps closer to 40 this afternoon. Around Bristol Bay, low to mid 40s. The Alaska Peninsula was also mild in the upper 40s to about the mid 50s there. Sand Point 48. Dutch Harbor on Alaska was at 46. The Pribilovs holding just shy of 40 this afternoon, and low to mid 40s for the western and central parts of the chain. The low temperatures tonight will be fairly mild across the west and southwest with that persistent southerly flow. Look for most areas to stay above freezing, including McGrath at 39. The Aleutians and a good part of the Alaska Peninsula also at or at least above freezing. Some places like Cold Bay and Falls Pass may hover closer to 40 degrees. Same goes for Adak and Atka. Southeast expect lows in the mid-30s to about 40 degrees. Sitka 38, Juneau 35. Looks like Heidelberg closer to 42 degrees. Prince William Sound also a little bit on the mild side, 34 around Valdez, with Homer and Seward in the upper 30s, Anchorage closer to 40. As you move into the interior, upper 30s for overnight lows around Fairbanks and the Tanana Valley, 29 in Eagle, teens for Anaktuvuk Pass, and also for the Arctic coast in the mid to upper teens for most areas. Kodiak 41 with a high of 48 tomorrow. Look for South Central to warm quickly into the upper 50s, maybe even 60 for Talkeetna. 61 for areas around Tanana, 62 in Fairbanks. Warmth spreading eastward into the upper Yukon Valley as well. Fort Yukon 55. Low to mid 50s for a large part of southeast. The Alaska Peninsula and the chain in the low to mid 40s. In some cases around Bristol Bay nearing the mid 50s to 60 degrees around King Salmon. 40 in Nunivak Island, 42 in Nome. And the heat makes it to the Arctic coast with high temperatures tomorrow hovering fairly close to freezing, including Barrow and Prudhoe Bay and Deadhorse, so mushing out a little bit more. Flying weather shows MVFR conditions across a large part of southeast, maybe IFR across the southern parts of the inner waterways down into the Dixon entrance, and then a broad swath of IFR conditions offshore of the west coast and through the Bering Strait, including the Pribilofs and maybe the eastern chain, and another wave of lower visibility across the western Bering Sea. Here's your past conditions then. If you're flying across the mainland, things look pretty good just about in any direction you're traveling, with VFR conditions through the Alaska Range and across the Brooks Range. Rainy Pass, VFR. Windy Pass looks to be just fine. Visual through Isabel Pass and probably Mentasta and Tanita Pass as well. Look for VFR conditions through Portage and also through Chilkoot and White Pass during your Wednesday. Now the freezing lines are starting to look messy again. That means warmer air is pumping itself northward fairly quickly. You can see the surface freezing line here draped in white running all the way up into the mid-Yukon Valley and then dropping quickly across the Alaska Range and hovering close to the northern Gulf Coast. The red lines, of course, are the freezing lines aloft, and they range from 2,000 feet to as high as 6,000 feet across the southern Bering Sea and parts of Bristol Bay. And also you can see warmer air trying to work its way northward toward Haida Gwaii and the Dixon entrance. Doesn't quite make it there. The point is, though, that warmer air is certainly invading Alaska and fast. Icing potential shows at least light to isolated moderate across some spotty areas through the eastern chain, through the Bering Strait, and also across the North Pacific, closing in on the western part of the Aleutians. We also have a pocket, a little bit of moisture running around the Brooks Range below 12,000 feet, but above 4,000 feet. Some of that might reach into the occasional moderate range, and then below 14,000, but above 6,000 across the Dixon entrance and the southern parts of southeast. The jet stream shows what's going on in the upper parts of our atmosphere, around 30,000 feet or so, and a large ridge of high pressure sitting across the Pacific Northwest is guiding in that wet weather across the southern parts of southeast. But we have low pressure just to the south and west of that, and that's guiding in some very dry air off the continent, keeping things fairly pleasant and warm for a large part of the interior. And the main weather system shows a pretty predominant trough across the western Bering Sea and the North Pacific, guiding in that warm Pacific air right through the Bering and the west coast and keeping things pretty stable across a large part of the interior. 9,000 feet, and here's our high pressure ridge sitting very close to the western Alaska Range in Bristol Bay. Winds again moving from west to east about 20 to 40 knots. The strongest winds will be right along the west coast from about 40 to 50 knots. And we also have a little bit of a turbulence expectations there with the trough of low pressure working through the western Bering. Expect some shear as the winds shift a little bit there, especially from elevation to altitudes, different altitudes. Going in between, you'll probably run into some changing wind directions there. And not only that, but also speed across the southern Bering. You'll notice wind speeds starting out around 45 to 60 knots and then slowly diminishing to about 40 to 50 knots, getting up toward the western tip of the Seward Peninsula. Now, interior, south of the Alaska Range, wind speed should be pretty light in the proximity of high pressure, only about 5 to 10 knots or so. But if you're moving north of the Yukon, across the Brooks Range or into the Arctic coast, wind speeds might be as high as 45 knots. Coming out of southeast, winds from the north and northwest around 10 to 15 knots, and things should be pretty slow if you're flying around Kodiak Island. Wind speeds there at 3,000 feet, only 5 to about 10 knots. Turbulence potential, we would expect the greatest threat below 4,000 feet around the Bering Strait, the Chukchi Seacoast down toward the Seward Peninsula, and then below 6,000 feet for the eastern parts of the chain. Otherwise, a large part of the Bering is under light to isolated moderate, and for most of southeast, south central, and the interior, you should have relatively smooth sailing tomorrow. That's a look at your aviation forecast. We'll be back with a little bit more on your marine weather here in just a few minutes. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, joined again by Eric Stevens from the GINA, or Geographic Information Network of Alaska at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Thanks for joining us again, Eric.
Glad to be here.
Thanks. We are talking about satellites today, and what are satellites? And the easy way to talk about that would be to introduce our friend the globe here, which is a round spheroid type shape. We haven't been on a flat Earth as far as history is known for several hundred years now, and because of that we also know that we are orbiting around other objects in space, and that objects are orbiting around the Earth as well. We call all those things satellites in some form or fashion, right, Eric?
Right. Well, this leads to the discussion of Johannes Kepler's research 400 years ago. Did some of the early work and founded the 3 laws of planetary motion, which are important to planets and also to weather satellites.
Okay.
Kepler's first law talks about how the orbit of an object around another object is an ellipse, not necessarily a circle.
Kind of a flattened circle?
Yeah, depending on how flat it could be.
Okay.
For our purposes, we'll just say they're mostly circular.
Okay.
The second law is most important for us, though, and that is the closer an object is to the thing it's orbiting, the faster it goes. So in the solar system, the planet Mercury is the closest planet to the sun. It orbits the sun in 88 days. It moves at 100,000 kilometers an hour.
It is just
moving.
Okay.
Right. And further out from the Earth is Jupiter, and it moves at only 1/4 the speed of Mercury, and it has to go further, so it takes 12 of our years for Jupiter to make one lap. The further out you are, the slower you go.
Okay.
So we're talking about planets. What does it have to do with weather satellites? Turns out Kepler's laws apply to planets orbiting the sun. They also apply to satellites orbiting the Earth.
Okay.
You know, our natural satellite is the moon. There's the famous Apollo 8 Earthrise shot.
Beautiful shot.
Oh, yeah, you could just talk about that forever. December 1968, the moon is about 250,000 miles away from the Earth.
Okay.
Takes a month to go around the Earth. It's that far out, it takes a full month to do an orbit. Another shot here of the International Space Station. Instead of being 250,000 miles out, the ISS is only 250 miles up. It's really close. And so it doesn't take a full month for the space station to go around the Earth. It only takes 90 minutes. It's so close, it just whips right around 90 minutes.
Okay.
So weather satellites, there are a number of weather satellites, and there are a number of orbits. The further out you have the satellite, the longer it takes to go around the Earth. And this is important because different satellites have different purposes. So we have a satellite here. This little salt shaker lid will serve as our satellite going around the Earth. Let's say you have a satellite that's 22,000 miles above the Earth. This is kind of a magical spot because at that distance, it takes a full day for the satellite to go around the Earth. Imagine if you put your satellite 22,000 miles up from the equator and had it go with the Earth as the Earth spun.
At the same speed.
Right. The satellite goes around the Earth just as fast as the Earth itself is turning. In effect, the satellite will hover in one spot.
I see.
And it appears when you make a movie loop of picture after picture after picture, you can replay that and you get these movie loops. Geostationary satellites, these are called. These are stationary in appearance. And they provide a constant frame of reference. We've got an example here. Another nice thing about these satellites, since they're that far out at 22,000 miles, you can see from pole to pole, which is nice. So they're pretty broad view and a constant frame of reference.
So those are the pictures. If you're watching a weather satellite loop on TV, your favorite weather show, that's the picture that you're going to see is one that's sitting over the same spot.
If you're seeing a movie loop play again and again, that came from geostationary satellites. That's the only way you can do that.
Yeah.
The bummer, though, for us in Alaska is we're up on the very top of the planet. And for geostationary satellites to work, they have to be over the equator. So for the geostationary bird to view Alaska, it's kind of like reading a book, but you're reading it edge on like that.
Right.
So there's another kind of orbit called the polar orbit,
Okay.
which is nice. We're near the pole.
Yeah.
And here's a satellite. Those polar orbiters are much closer to the Earth, getting down toward International Space Station elevation. And they're not in the equatorial plane. Rather, their orbital plane is inclined like this. And the Earth turns under that satellite as the satellite orbits. The nice thing about that is for Alaska, the satellite will go right over Alaska a few times a day. And so you get a much closer image. We've got a shot from the Sumi NPP satellite. Specifically, it's a true color image from the VIRS sensor. That's an acronym there.
Okay.
But it's a beautiful shot of Alaska, and you can see so much detail. The kind of detail, because you're close in,
Very high resolution.
you couldn't get this kind of view from geostationary satellites. The advantage of these polar orbiters is nice close imagery. You can see a lot of detail. The disadvantage, though, is that the satellite flies by,
Right.
and then you have to wait a while to get the next image. And if geostationary weaknesses are that you're reading the page like that, the polar orbiter, you're reading the page straight on, but it's so close, and then it zips by, and you have to wait for the satellite to come around the Earth again. So there's no one perfect solution. Different satellites for different orbits, each has their strength, and amazingly, it all comes back to Johannes Kepler and his laws of planetary motion. The same laws that govern how the planets orbit the sun, they govern how the satellites orbit the Earth, and even our little pretend salt shaker right here.
Right, okay. Well, since the 1957 Sputnik, we've been putting man-made objects into orbit around the Earth and starting to get pictures back. Who knows what will happen in the next 50 to 100 years. Amazing
it's
stuff.
a growing science, and the future is bright.
Thank you so much for joining us again, Eric. And for more information on GINA and what the satellite systems do there and what Eric's been talking about today, you can go to the web address on your screen. For Alaska Weather Facts, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider. Thanks, Dave. Here's a look at today's sea ice edge. And as you look out across the northern Bering Sea, obviously a little bit of a change going on just in the last couple of days. And with a strong southerly flow working over the Aleutians into the Bering, we're going to see some more changes by the time we have a new map tomorrow and again by later in the week. So look for more and more open water. If you'd like to keep tabs on the sea ice outlook or perhaps the latest change there issued Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for now, with more updates coming probably pretty soon in the near future, go to weather.gov/anchorage/ice.php and you can download the shapefiles to make a map very similar to this. In this case, we're using Google Earth. Here's a look at southeast marine forecast with northerly winds, pretty light, about 15 to 20 knots or so. Should be a pretty pleasant day. Now, some changes there across the southern parts of southeast. You'll see more clouds and a better chance of showers there. And across the Clarence and Chatham Straits, you're looking at probably 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. Offshore winds otherwise, or at least winds blowing parallel to the coast from the north, around 15 to 20 knots. By Thursday, more of an offshore flow develops in all areas, and we get our northerly flow back across the southern inner waterways. They'll still be around 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. Lynn Canal winds running around 25 knots with a 5-foot sea. Otherwise, offshore flow from Yakutat all the way down to Craig, 15 to 20 knots with 4 to 6-foot seas as we head into Thursday. For South Central, winds are going to be light and variable in just about all areas for Wednesday. Up and down the Cook Inlet with seas 1 to 2 feet. Around the Barren Islands on either side, 10-knot winds with 2 to 4-foot seas. And then we see more of a southwesterly flow developing on either side of Kodiak Island with seas between 2 to 4 feet and 10-knot winds coming in again from the south and west. Variable flow and just about flat seas inside Prince William Sound. More of a westerly flow outside, 15 knots with a 6-foot sea. As we get into Thursday, we're still looking at light winds, maybe a little bit more of a northerly flow across the northern parts of the Cook Inlet. But most areas are looking at 10-knot winds or less, a variable flow, and seas between 2 and 4 feet. For Wednesday, a southeasterly flow inside Bristol Bay at 15 knots with a 12-foot sea. Look for more of an 8-foot sea there coming in from the south. I'm sorry, that should be about 2 feet, I suspect. A variable flow south of Kodiak Island and east of Chignik. A 3-foot sea is expected there. As we get into Thursday, that's more like it. A northerly flow with a 10-knot wind and 2-foot seas. Southeasterlies north and east of Cold Bay. 20-knot wind there with a 5-foot sea. And easterlies south of Sand Point and King Cove. 20 knots with an 8-foot sea. A northerly flow, though, south of Chignik and Kodiak Island, 15 knots with a 16-foot sea, a 6-foot sea, again producing a little bit more of an offshore flow. There. Now, let's get into the Aleutians. Let's see if we can get this one right. Westerlies across the western Aleutians with an 11-foot sea, Southerlies across Kiska at 30 knots, and then you get more of a broad south and southeasterly flow. Gales, low-end gales, 30 to 35 knots, 20 knots in fact, south of Adak and Atka with 13-foot seas there, a little bit higher seas a little bit further east. And north of Unalaska and Nikolsky, you're looking at 17-foot seas. That's for Wednesday. For Thursday, seas diminish, winds diminish, still looking at a south and southeasterly wind, variable flow around Kiska with 8-foot seas, 9-foot seas out around Chemya with a southerly flow at 25 knots. Now across the west coast and into the Bering Sea, winds are picking up around St. Lawrence Island, 40 knots with a 6-foot sea. Remember, we've got a frontal boundary and low pressure working its way across the northern Bering at this point. So we're going to have the winds pick up and probably looking at a predominant southerly flow, a little bit of a shift south of Nunivak Island and around the Pribilofs as we get into Thursday. 5-foot seas closer to land, and then out around the Pribilofs you're looking at 12-foot seas, and that's right there along the coastal areas of the islands. A southerly flow makes its way all the way through the Bering Strait on Wednesday into places like Kotzebue Sound at 40 knots, 20-knot winds north of Barrow, and a south and westerly shift there from Bruto Bay to Kaktovik, 15 to 20 knots. And then you get into a south and southwesterly flow on Thursday. Winds diminish somewhat, still looking at 20 to 30-knot winds, though, for most areas along the Arctic coast. Recapping tonight's weather, a weak wave of low pressures working across the Brooks Range there. Look for some continued areas of wind and snow across some of the higher terrain. Winter weather advisories have been posted there. Red flag warnings continue for a little while into the evening hours for the Alaska Range and the eastern sections and the Deltana Tanana Flats region. A few showers across southeast and a much larger storm working into the Bering at 978 millibars. That frontal boundary will work itself more north than east, so we're going to keep that southerly flow very close to the west coast and a chance for scattered showers there. Some of that might turn into snow north of the Bering Strait. As we get into Thursday, it looks like the frontal boundary will continue out across the west and will continue with gusty southerly and warm winds across the western parts of Alaska. For the very latest weather information, join us online anytime at weather.gov. For Alaska Weather, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.